Hey, my name's Malcolm, and this is another tutorial on making bullets and param patching with the Hexington cheat engine table. Briefly, I just want to point out that I'm not going to go over every single thing under these params because a lot of them aren't useful and a lot of them are self-explanatory. Most of them do not do anything, or at least they aren't useful enough to be regarded as having done anything. So I'm just going to cover the most useful or the most commonly used things under bullet and effect. This will really only be for bullets and effects, but in the future there may be more. It's fairly self-explanatory if you look at what the actual structs are for, but bullet and effect are a little strange and have a few quirks with them that aren't really explainable until you test them, but this should clarify a decent portion of them at least. The latest version of Param Patcher includes every param you could edit in the game. This, like I said, will only be covering bullet and effect, but if you really wanted to, you could edit anything in the game regarding a param. It's a little more tricky figuring out what some of them do. I don't know what most of these do. Most of them aren't useful really in any way, but if you really want to, you can edit anything you want now. So if you haven't seen the first video, you first need to join the Discord. Otherwise, the param patcher won't work. This isn't going to cover how to set up your table and everything. It's just going to cover how to use param patcher. If you don't know how to set it up, please go to the Discord server and look at the tutorials on how to set up your table and set up Elden Ring and disable easy anti-cheat and all of that. So first thing I'm going to go over is bullets. It's very tricky learning how to actually use all of these, but this will be a good explanation for most of it. You can start out with using the logger, or you can go to the Elden Ring ID list. So looking at the ID list, this would be the ID for the projectile. Sometimes there are other IDs related to the same bullet. This would be the actual burst that you see at the beginning of the cast. The little flash at the beginning would be the cast, and this would be the actual projectile. So we'll take the projectile and we'll put it into the ID. You could also use the logger instead. While it's running, it'll collect any bullets that are fired, and you can either paste it in manually or you can double click and it'll automatically put it in here. This is the cast, and this is the actual projectile. We'll close that. So to start at the very top, attack ID relates to the attack param. There's thousands of attacks in this game. It stores, this would indicate things like damage, knockback type, if they fall down, hit you but not deal damage, and you can set it to things like 0 for it to not do anything. SFX ID, when you see SFX in these, it really means the visual. It's not a sound effect or anything. This is the visual ID essentially for Glintstone Pebble when it is flying through the air. This is the visual that'll show up when it hits a surface. This is the visual that'll show up when it hits things like a shield. Life is how long the bullet will actually last in the air. If you set it to 0, it won't do anything. It'll stop as soon as it starts. Now this is when it starts getting into the tricky stuff. Distance has to do with how far it goes until it does some of the things below here, and I'll go over that later. But if you have it set to 0, then it'll happen, some of these things like gravity in and out will happen instantly. Or if you have it set to something like 12 like it has now, it'll take a moment before it actually occurs. Shoot interval is for continuous casts like Fire Surge, or Surge O Flame as it's called in this game. If you have this set to 0, it won't do anything. But if you have it set to something like 1, while you're casting, it'll fire off every 1 second. And you can set it as low as 0.01 and it'll fire off very quickly. So gravity in and out. In range means it'll apply while it's within this unit of 12, and out means it'll apply when it's outside of this unit of 12. So if I do something like 50 gravity in the gravity out, this will make it drop after it goes 12 units, or whatever this represents. So it flies out 12 and then it drops. And then opposite would be this, where if it's in range, it'll just drop as long as it's in range. And you can combine these to do some interesting things. Homing stop range is how far it travels out until it stops homing on the target. This is for things like, well, glintstone pebble, where it'll start homing and then it'll simply fly straight after it travels a certain distance. Initial velocity has to do with the speed that the bullet starts at, and excel in and out again relate to distance, where it'll accelerate by this amount while it's in range, and it'll accelerate by this amount when it's out of range. So the initial speed is 13. So when it starts out, it's normally slow, but since these make them excel in and out of range, if I set it to 0, it'll always stay at 13. If you wanted to make this really fast, you could set this high, but then you also need to set the below thing higher, which is max velocity and minimum velocity. Something I didn't mention is these values don't have to be positive always. You can set them to negative. So if you did negative 13 velocity, it would go backwards. Accel time, of course, relates to the acceleration in and out range. If you set this to something really low, it'll take a longer time for it to accelerate. We can set this to 5, and we can set initial velocity to, let's say, 1, and now it'll take a much longer time for it to start speeding up. But you won't actually see it because it dies before that. Homing begin distance. This is, again, related to distance. Once this value is reached, it will begin homing. Hit radius is fairly self-explanatory. It's just the hitbox of the bullet. If it's really high, it'll hit the ground while you're casting it. If it's really low, it'll have to be dead on hitting whatever it needs to. Hit radius max is roughly the same as hit radius, but it's related to spread time, where it will start at this and end at this, and it'll take this long for it to do that. Damage hit record lifetime has to do with how frequently the bullet will hit while it's alive. For things like warmth, if you remember in Dark Souls 3, that would tick like every 1 or 2 seconds. So this would be 1 or 2 for this. If you set it to something really low, it'll be rapid. If you set it to 0, it won't do anything. SP effect ID for shooter is related to when the bullet is created, it will apply the effect to yourself, whatever you have here. So if I take an effect from here, let's say 20, the message rate heal, and it'll apply it to myself. Auto search NPC think ID. This has to do with things like pursuers or soul mass, any of the bullets that float above your head. Hit bullet ID is what the bullet is that will spawn when the bullet dies. We'll use comment. And it can happen when it just expires normally or it hits a surface. Each of these are the effects applied when the bullet hits. So things like bleed, poison, etc. Numbshoot is just how many bullets are created. Homing angle has to do with the max it will actually turn toward a target. Since glintstone doesn't actually home for very long, after this distance, it'll stop homing. Shoot angle will offset how you fire your spell. So if you have it set to something like 15, it'll go slightly off to the right based on where you're aiming. And then negative 15 will go off to the left. Shoot angle interval relates to numbshoot, which is how you get the fanning effect for some spells, where you can have an interval between each of these. So now it'll fan out. Didn't input it correctly. Now it'll fan out. And the same for the x-axis. Fans out vertically. Combining them would make it diagonal. Shoot angle XZ is the same as shoot angle, just that it's on the X-axis. Lock shoot limit angle. This one's a little more tricky to explain. Think of it as when the bullet is fired and you're locked onto a target and that target suddenly moves behind you. It would need this to be 180 for it to track it. Is penetrate, all you need to know is when it's set to 1, it'll go through the target or the object. This doesn't work with the actual world like the ground. Launch condition type. These already have presets, but don't think these are totally accurate right now. This also has to do with the homing for the bullets that float around your head, like soul math. Follow type will also be related to that. Makes it so that it follows on you instead of being fired like normal. Emit position type, mostly the same thing. Is attack SFX. This one is a little strange. There are bullets that do this behavior where they float around on the ground. Is endless hit, like it says, it just makes it so it spawns between your feet. Is spawn at closest enemy. This is self-explanatory. It spawns it on the closest enemy. Is penetrate map. This one just makes it fly through the map. Is hit both team. This is related to things like warmth, like before. If it's set to 1, it can hit friendlies and enemies. One of these does what I just said. I have no idea what this is. You can look at existing bullets, kind of understand what things are. This one you kind of just have to test out. Spell parryable. Obviously this means it can get absorbed by Thop's barrier and stuff like that. Auto follow target is like that. These do not do what they say. This just kind of adds random spread to your bullet. Emitter bullet ID, emitter shoot interval. All of this is spawning more bullets while the other bullet is active. So every half second, it'll spawn the bullet. And you can even do it with the existing bullet that you're firing it with, but that'll crash your game. Bullet crate limit ID. This is leftover, but it does exist for current things. This was for warmth in Dark Souls 3. Now it would be used for that one pebble thing that causes a healing barrier that you can only have one up at a time. Target penetrate. This just makes it go straight through the target. It won't even hurt them or affect them. Object ID spawns objects where the bullet impacts. If you have the object ID, this obviously is pretty cool. Now we can actually look at effects. And I had to use an older table. The current version 1.7 is not correct, so if you look at it you will not see all of these. It'll be a little messed up down here and incorrect, so just wait for the patch on that. I don't think I need to explain what effects are. Things that apply to you or others that change your stats, or your summoning torrent is an effect, weapon buffs are effects, you know, everything like that. To see what effects are happening, you can use the logger again. This is your idle effect. This is always on you no matter what. I don't actually know what this one is, but this one I'm using for this example, which is my Crimson Amber Medallion effect, so that when I take it off I won't be affected by it anymore. Just a good way to toggle it on and off. So starting from the top, icon ID. This is the ID, and this is what it's referring to. This can be changed to any ID, any icon in the game that is compatible with that slot. So as you can see, it's different now. Condition HP. Effect endurance is the life of it. When you see this, just think it's the life of the effect. -1 means it lasts forever. Motion interval is how many times it will repeat over this duration. That's not exactly correct, but it's basically how quickly it'll repeat. If it's set to 0, it'll never do it. If it's set to 1, it'll repeat every 1 second, or roughly every 1 second. Now this doesn't mean it'll start stacking and turning off and stuff like that, because you can see I can still have the effect on me even though this is set to 1. It's not doing anything every 1 second, but it will apply other things of the effect onto you every 1 second. But for now, we'll just set this back to 0. This is pretty self-explanatory. It just increases your max HP by this amount. Since it's the Amber Medallion, it has a small health increase. Looks like it's 5%, or just at 6%. You can do it so that your health goes way higher. Same for MP. You can set it to whatever. It'll increase it by that amount. 1 is 100%. 0.5 would be half. Pretty easy to understand. All of these damage cut rates are your defenses. So if you have 1 on all of these, you take 100% damage. If you have it at half, 0.5 in other words, you'll take half damage. So if I go to status, I already have some defenses here, but you can see they're all, except for Holy. We'll get to that later. There's a reason why Holy isn't matching up with the rest of these. But you can see when I switch these back, they go back to normal. And you can make yourself take double damage if you set it to 2. So now I'm going to take way more. Attack rate, this is the same. Whenever you see rate, just think percentage. Attack rate, these don't do exactly what you think. If you go to attack power though, these do. So these afflict all of your physical, all of your magic, but I don't have any magic on that fire, so you can't really see the difference. But with physical, you can see that it goes up. Attack power, this is flat. You can tell by it being a 4-byte and this being a float. These are percentage, but the physics attack power, this is just a flat increase. 500 will be 528 total attack. This is a typo, but this is actually how it's spelled in the game. But this is defense. So same thing with the cut rate. It would be this much flat added. It's a little hard to explain. This is like your flat number addition, and this is your percentage reduction. So if you have defense rate turned up, it's still a percentage, but not of this, it's of this. So double of that, and it would equal double. You see what I'm saying? It's hard to explain, but... And then this is your actual flat defense. So add 500, now it's 576. No guard damage rate, vital spot, and normal spot. These aren't actually used by anything in the game. I'm pretty sure these are just related to... I'm pretty sure these are from older games when you could hit people with Leo Ring and it would deal more counter damage. Behavior ID is actually really useful, but you need the behavior IDs for them. Basically, behaviors are a separate set similar to bullet in effect, but they're only activated through certain means. Like when you swing a weapon, it can spawn a behavior ID, or when you activate an effect. And behavior IDs can use bullets or effects. So it's like a subcategory of these. This would take a little bit more to explain, but you can test this out with plenty of stuff and you'll quickly figure it out. Okay, so I just killed myself doing this, so make sure you remember that negative is healing and positive hurts you. So you can do 1 for just a second and you'll see that it takes out every time this ticks. So pretty much as fast as it can, it will tick 1% of my HP away. But if I do -1, it'll heal 1% of my HP. This is the point. So it would be however many points you tell it, it'll do such to where it takes away 1 HP every tick, or it'll heal 1 HP every tick. Or you can make it do 5 HP. MP rate, MP point, same exact stuff. Rate is percent, point is raw. These don't do anything anymore. Very sad. This had to do with durability. Fall damage rate used by cat ring and stuff like that reduces your fall damage. Set it to 0, you won't take any fall damage. Soul rate is a multiplier for how many souls you get, or runes in this case, in this game. So you could set this to 2 to double how many souls you get. Equip weight change rate has to do with your weight. So you can see my equip load is 46. If I double it, now it has way more, and I can go way higher. Now I can equip whatever I want now. Or you could set it really low and you can always be overloaded. Soul gives you souls. If you put anything in here, it'll just give you a shitload of them. Now this is interesting. This actually has to do with your camouflage. You can set this to 0 for both and enemies will just ignore you. Gravity rate used to increase your animation speed, but it doesn't do anything anymore. These are your resists, percentage based. This is the best thing in the whole game. This will cycle whatever you put into here, whatever effect ID. So you can put stuff like, let's say like this, you put this in, and now you have a fire weapon. But this is good because you can dynamically change it all the time, and it'll always update depending on your motion interval. Attack occurrence is not while you're attacking, it's when you're hitting something. So this applies to you when you hit somebody. If your weapon, when you use it, hurts yourself or bleeds yourself when you hit somebody successfully, that's what this is for. So state info is actually really important. It's essentially a different container for another effect, but that's not entirely accurate. The best way to describe it would be it's a state your character can enter when it's applied by an effect. So for example, curse is a state. Being zoomed into your binoculars is a state. The curse doesn't actually get applied via all of these. It only gets applied from the state. So if you have the curse effect here and you find this and you set it to none, then you won't get cursed anymore. These have to do with summoning or multiplayer stuff. If any of these are flipped to 1, it'll do what it says. This will try to kick. This will make you leave. This VFX ID address and these ones will just change the visual of what's applied to you. How they are applied to you depends on a few things. A few other structs control that, but it can either be applied to your weapon or your body or just one portion of it. That's all determined by another one. Toughness, damage, cut rate actually seems to affect your poise in some way. I'm not totally sure how it works, but it seems that the closer to 0 you get, the more poise you get. Anything labeled dark is actually holy, since they just renamed it in the game, but I guess they didn't change it in the actual parameters for the game. So you can set this to something and it'll increase your holy defense. Item drop rate, if you set this to be higher, it'll make drop rates higher. Add life force status, willpower status, all of these that say status are actually just your stats. So if you set your life to 50, it increases your vigor by 50 levels. And then you can set it back. And for now, that's really all there is to it. I'll likely go over more things in the future, but those are the ones that most people will be wanting to use, and that should help explain what you're really looking at. You can also use programs like YAP and UXM to unpack the game and look at the params in more detail, and it'll show all values for everything used in the game. But you do not want to use them for actually changing values. If you do, and then you patch the game using UXM, you'll likely get banned. So not a good idea to do that. Try to use just Cheat Engine when you're doing this, otherwise you're going to get screwed. But Yapt is still really good for looking at everything in the game.